The cool, shocking grip on her arm, firm and undeniably possessive, was the only thing that kept Ilara's trembling knees from failing her completely. The scent of pine and rich, spiced mead, heavy in the Count's grand winter hall, was suddenly suffocating. She stood, thin shoulders rigid beneath the coarse wool of her borrowed coat, staring at the exquisite crimson velvet upholstery of the chair where she'd expected to sit beside a man she'd hoped would be her savior. But the chair was empty. It was a monument to her failure. Outside, the Yule snow fell like an indifferent judgment. Preston Valerius, the man who had promised a future, a home, a chance for her son Cale to survive the cruel winter, the man she was supposed to meet tonight, had sent a curt, dismissive letter with his servant. Circumstances have changed. My apologies. The arrangement is nullified. It was worse than a rejection. It was a final, devastating sentence delivered on the eve of Yule. The Night Hope was supposed to be born anew. Her hands, calloused and chapped from the cold, were still clutching the small, exquisitely carved wooden bear she'd hoped Cale could give him, a child's desperate bribe for a father. The servant, a gaunt, pitying thing, had gently returned the bear and whispered a warning about the Count's volatile temper. Ilara felt a deep, wrenching pain in her chest, a physical agony far beyond mere disappointment. She hadn't traded her son, not truly. She had offered a future to Preston in exchange for one for Cale, a future where Cale would have food, warmth, and protection from the creeping shadowkin blight that haunted the edges of their remote village. She had offered her hand in marriage, her loyalty, her whole weary, broken self. Now, she had nothing. She turned to leave, her vision blurring, the shame a bitter taste on her tongue. It was then, as she took the first step toward the doors that led back into the howling, indifferent blizzard, that the cool hand tightened again. She looked up, startled, into eyes the color of old silver, observing her with an unnerving, quiet intensity. He was not a servant, not a minor noble. He was a pillar of the room's deep shadows, a man whose tailored black velvet coat seemed to absorb the light. The arrangement is nullified. The man's voice, a low, smooth baritone that resonated deep in her bones, echoed Preston's words, yet somehow stripped them of their cruelty. But that does not mean you must freeze in the street, little star. His gaze, calm and utterly unreadable, swept over her worn coat and the pathetic carved bear she still held. I believe, he continued, a faint, almost imperceptible curl to his lip, that Count Valerius has a certain reputation for misjudgment. He is a man who throws away the gold he mistakes for copper. Ilara could only stare. This man, whoever he was, carried an air of effortless power, a palpable aura of ancient nobility that made Preston look like a country magistrate. Who was he, and why was he watching her, the desperate widow who had failed her child? Her fear warred with a sudden, desperate flicker of hope, but the hope was quickly smothered by the memory of Cale's thin frame and empty gaze. I have to go, she whispered, the words catching in her throat like sharp glass. My son, he needs food. He doesn't know. I promised him. She couldn't finish. The raw vulnerability of her confession hung in the air, a stark contrast to the opulence around them. The man's silver eyes never left hers. A son, an anchor in the storm, he murmured, a shadow of something unreadable passing over his face. Tell me your name and his. Tell me what you promised him. It was an order, not a question, yet it was delivered with a strange, intimate grace. This man, a terrifying vision of dark, restrained power, felt like a dangerous final resort. And Ilara, with nothing left to lose, began to speak, the true story of her heart spilling out in hushed, hurried whispers, the story of Cale's illness, the dwindling rations, the brutal winter, and the desperation that had led her to Preston's humiliating bargain. Lysander Veronin, the true master of the Shadowfen barony, and a vampire king who preferred the company of dusty tomes and ancient starlight to human politics, felt an almost forgotten flicker of something akin to rage. He had been observing the pitiful display from the shadowed balcony, planning to leave before the tedious Yule festivities began. He had witnessed the small, beaten woman's arrival, the delivery of the cold, brutal note, and the collapse of her desperate hope. He saw not a woman trying to trade her child, but a mother fighting the indifferent void of poverty and loss. He saw himself, centuries ago, fighting a different kind of void. He had walked among humans for so long that he often forgot their resilience, their capacity for profound love in the face of annihilation. This woman, Elara Selwyn, was a testament to it. Her tale of Kale, her 5-year-old son, was heartbreakingly simple, a child who needed life and a mother who had run out of time and options. Preston Valerius, Lysander's irritatingly ambitious Dajagger Count, a weak title that Lysander tolerated but barely respected, had shown his true colors, discarding a life as easily as a crumpled piece of parchment. He promised me a lifetime of security, Elara finished, her voice raw. I promised Kale a full belly and warmth by the fire. He will be heartbroken. He trusts me. The cool marble table behind Lysander seemed to grow colder as his internal focus sharpened. He stepped closer, and the silver of his eyes deepened. Preston's cruelty, Lysander stated, his voice now carrying the weight of centuries, was merely a beginning, not an end. It was the closing of a cheap door that opened upon a vast, better road. You were never meant for a man of his shallow ambition, Elara. Selwyn. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers brushing the delicate line of her jaw, the movement startling her into complete stillness. His touch was cool, shocking so, but steady and firm. It felt like an impossible anchor in the swirling chaos. I will not ask you to trade your son. I will ask you to trust me. The Count offered you bread for your life. I offer you a life where bread is never a question, a life for you and for Kale. A life that will perhaps be terrifying, but never hungry or cold. He paused, letting the implication sink in. The Shadowkin that frightened her village were children to the power he wielded. He was their king. He looked down at the pathetic wooden bear. Keep the bear. It is a son's gift to a father. I will accept it when Kale is ready to give it freely. Now tell me where you live. I will send a carriage and my best guard to bring the boy here. Elara's breath hitched. She looked up at him, tears finally, miserably spilling onto her cheeks. Who are you? She whispered. He gave a small, weary smile, a flicker of humanity that softened the sharp lines of his face. I am Lysander Veronin, the man Valerius believes he serves, and tonight I am merely the man who is professionally trained in vegetable negotiations and in keeping a mother's promises to her son. The sudden appearance of the imposing, ebony-colored carriage outside their miserable, snow-shrouded cottage should have been terrifying. It was pulled by 2 great black horses whose eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, and the driver, a massive, silent man, wrapped in layers of dark leather, waited patiently. But Elara was numb to fear. The moment she'd stepped back into the bitter cold, Lysander's promise and the heavy, gold-inlaid coin he had pressed into her hand had become her only reality. She felt light, almost unburdened, yet desperately fragile. Kyle, curled under a threadbare blanket, looked up at her with wide, trusting brown eyes. Mama, did the kind man say yes? Did he say we can stay? His small, hopeful voice was like a knife twist. Elara sank down beside him, pulling his cold body against hers. She couldn't lie, but she wouldn't crush his spirit either. The kind man did not come, my little sprout, she whispered, tears thick in her throat. But a much, much kinder man did, a man who said you and I deserve all the warm fires and all the fresh bread in the world. We are going on an adventure, Kale. We are going to a castle. Kale's eyes grew rounder. A castle? With knights? With something much more interesting than knights. Ilara managed a shaky smile. She bundled him quickly, stuffing their few, paltry belongings into a worn sack. The journey back to the Count's grand hall, or rather to the true heart of the sprawling ancient estate, was a blur of silent speed and breathtaking cold. When they finally arrived, they weren't taken to the ballroom. They were taken to a quiet, immense study lit by a roaring fire and stacked high with scrolls. Lysander was waiting for them, seated at a massive desk, studying a map. He rose as they entered, his height and presence commanding immediate awe. Kyle, however, was unfazed. He simply stared up at the tall, pale man. Lysander's expression, usually reserved, softened the moment he saw the boy. "Welcome, Kyle Selwyn," he said, his voice gentle. "I am Lysander. Your mother and I have an agreement." He extended a hand, a large, cool hand. Kyle didn't hesitate. He took it, his little fingers wrapping trustingly around the Vampire King's thumb. "Are you a prince?" Kyle asked, his voice a piping sound in the huge room. Lysander let out a low, almost soundless laugh. "No, Kale, I am merely a student of old stories and a negotiator of the proper preparation of winter vegetables." The simple, shared humor was a sudden, unexpected warmth. Ilara felt a tremor of something new, relief mingled with a bewildering sense of destiny. Maybe they were supposed to cross tonight. Maybe every disappointment, every hungry night had led her here to this quiet, powerful man in this warm, unbelievable room. In the weeks that followed, Ilara's life transformed into an unbelievable reality. They were given comfortable, sunlit rooms in the oldest, quietest wing of the manor. Kyle thrived. He had endless supplies of milk and bread, books, and the playful attention of the manor's few, carefully vetted staff. He had even developed an almost ritualistic evening habit, sitting with Lysander in the study, asking profound, unfiltered questions about the stars, the forest, and the strange, silent people who visited the manor late at night. Lysander never lied. He spoke of the ethereal plane, of ancient bloodlines, and the quiet responsibilities of a Shadowfen king, but he couched it all in the language of lore and deep history, making it fascinating, never frightening. Ilara, meanwhile, was given a quiet, meaningful task, cataloging and restoring the manor's massive, neglected library. She spent her days surrounded by the rich, musty scent of ancient paper, a welcome contrast to the cold scent of poverty. She saw Lysander every evening for their quiet, intimate dinner, just the two of them. They talked of history, of books, of the fragile politics of the region, and never, ever, of the circumstances that had brought her there. The constraint, the space he gave her, was a profound gift. One night, while they were discussing a rare tome on astrological charting, Lysander paused, his silver eyes fixed on her. "You do not ask questions, Ilara," he observed. "You never ask why I did this or what I expect." She set down her wineglass. "I know why, Lysander. You saw a starving mother and a weak man's cruelty, and you intervened. It was an act of profound, unsolicited kindness. As for what you expect," she looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady. "I expect to work hard, to be loyal, and to teach my son gratitude. I owe you our lives. You do not need to ask for more." Lysander leaned back in his chair, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "You offered Preston your hand, Ilara. Did you expect to give him nothing more?" The question hung, heavy with implication. The warmth in the room suddenly felt like an oppressive heat. "I offered him a bargain out of desperation, Lysander," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I offered him a functional life partner in exchange for my son's life. It was a transaction. With you, it is different. I feel safe. And I feel that if you ever did ask for my hand, it would be an honor, not a price. The quiet honesty of her words seemed to resonate. The long, descriptive, and poetic sentence of her past intention was now contrasted by the simple, direct truth of her current feeling. Lysander's smile faded, replaced by that intense, serious gaze. I cannot offer you safety, Elara, only a fierce protection and a life woven with ancient shadows. I am not human. The sun is a danger, and the world believes I am a monster. To link your life to mine is to invite complication and fear. My life was already complicated and fearful, Lysander, she countered, her voice now strong. Fear of the cold, fear of hunger, fear of failure. I prefer the fear of the known, powerful monster who keeps his promises. The turning point came a week before the winter thaw. Kyle, playing in the conservatory, had accidentally knocked over a centuries-old bust of a forgotten Dajagger countess. Lysander, who walked in at that very moment, saw Kale's wide, tearful panic. The boy froze, terrified of the punishment he was sure was coming. Lysander simply knelt down, his dark cloak fanning out around him on the marble floor. A fine piece of historical commentary, Kale, he murmured, gently picking up a shattered fragment. The truth is, I never liked her. She was boring. Now, help me clean up your artistic statement and then tell me about the book you read today. No harm is done. Kale, relieved and confused, began to chatter about a story of a brave crow. Elara watched the interaction from the doorway, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't name. It was then, as she gazed at the formidable vampire king kneeling in the sunlight, filtered, of course, through the conservatory's dense, stained glass, and talking easily to her son, that the truth crystallized. This was not a bargain. This was not a debt. This was home. This was connection. That evening, at dinner, the air between them was electric. Lysander had been unusually quiet, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Elara finally broke the silence. Kale drew you a picture today, she said, placing a crude crayon drawing of a tall figure with a red cape and a large, misshapen sun on the table. He insisted the sun was allowed because he colored the windows dark. Lysander picked up the drawing, a genuine look of wonder in his silver eyes. He knows I am a creature of shadow, he said softly, and yet he paints the sun. He paints the light that he sees in you, Lysander, Elara replied simply, her hands trembling now, not from fear or cold, but from sheer, profound sentiment. The man who saves little boys and negotiates vegetables, the man who gives me dignity and work, that is light. She took a breath, the rhythmic pause necessary for the coming revelation. You asked me what I expect. I expect to be your wife, Lysander, not for my son's security, but for my own heart. I have loved you since the moment you offered to feed us both and let me keep my son. I accept the shadows. The room was silent. The only sound was the distant ticking of an ancient clock. Lysander's gaze, intense and unblinking, held hers. He reached across the table, not for her hand, but for the wooden bear that she now kept tucked securely in her apron pocket. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it back, his cool fingers briefly brushing her wrist. A child's gift for a father, he repeated the old phrase, his voice a low rumble. And a mother's devotion for a king. I am an old creature, Elara, old and complicated, but I accept the light you offer, and I will protect it fiercely. The formal announcement was quiet, almost entirely without pomp. Lysander, who shunned the courtly life, simply sent out a decree that the Shadowfen king had taken a consort, Elara Selwyn, and that her son, Kael, was now considered an heir and a ward of the barony. The few nobles who dared to object were met with a silent, chilling look from the king that rendered them immediately subservient. The wedding itself was a small, intimate ceremony held in the conservatory, the very place where Kyle had broken the bust, on a moonless night. The only guests were the handful of loyal, silent staff and Kyle, who proudly carried the train of Ilara's simple, deep blue velvet gown. When the vows were exchanged, Lysander, standing tall and imposing in his black finery, took her hands in his. I will be your shield against the world, Ilara, he promised, his voice low and earnest. And you will be my anchor to the light. The debt is canceled. Only the connection remains. Ilara, her eyes shining, simply squeezed his hands. I am yours, Lysander, all the way into the shadow. Kyle, the child as oracle, watched the exchange with a profound seriousness beyond his years. After the ceremony, as they walked back to the study for a simple dinner, Kyle, holding on to Lysander's hand, spoke the defining, simple dialogue of their destiny. Mama said the weak man didn't come because you were supposed to meet us instead, he stated, looking up at Lysander. Is that true? Lysander smiled, a flicker of genuine warmth spreading across his sharp features. It is absolutely true, Kale. The universe, it seems, has a fine sense of dramatic irony. Your mother's broken promise was the most important promise she ever kept. Their first year was marked by a steady, quiet happiness that Ilara had never dared to imagine. Kyle continued to flourish, his cough gone, his spirit bright. He and Lysander developed a deep, almost conspiratorial bond. Ilara, the simple widow, became the queen of the Shadowfen, not in title, but in her steady, kind influence. She softened the edges of Lysander's ancient isolation, bringing warmth and light to the dusty corners of his life. The common device of high contrast irony now defined their existence. The marriage born of a devastating rejection had become the purest form of acceptance. Ilara often found herself in the study late at night, watching Lysander work by the faint light of a magical globe, still amazed by the turn of fate. The empty chair had not signified failure, but a clearing of the space. One evening, while Lysander was away on a minor diplomatic errand, a servant delivered a message. Preston Valerius had fallen ill. He was dying, alone, and had begged for an audience with the woman he had dismissed. Ilara, showing her emotionally resilient protagonist nature, went. She found the Count a shadow of his former self, shivering in his lonely, enormous bed. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear and regret. Ilara, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I heard. The Shadow King. He took you. They say you are married. I was a fool. I threw away everything because I was a coward. Ilara sat quietly by his bed, her hand resting coolly on the rich but sterile blanket. You were a coward, Preston, she agreed, her tone measured, devoid of cruelty. You feared the expense, the complication, the weakness in your own heart. Lysander feared nothing, but risked everything for a promise. It is the difference between an ambition and a commitment. She didn't stay long. She offered him a small comfort, a cup of warm broth, and then left the house that had once represented her last desperate chance. She walked out into the cold night, the flickering candle in her hand the only source of light, feeling nothing but profound pity and a powerful rush of gratitude. The long, descriptive, and poetic sentence of her inner peace now began to define her world. She realized that she had been living in a constant state of tense, brittle survival, and now, under Lysander's fierce protection, she could finally simply be. She was deeply sentimental about her second chance. The scent of spiced mead, she mused one night, curled up by the fire in Lysander's study, used to remind me of that night and the cold shame. Now, it reminds me of the warmth in this room and the silence of your footsteps behind me. Lysander, who had just entered, placed a cool hand on the back of her head, his touch a familiar, anchoring sensation. Every sensory description is a battlefield of memory, little star, he murmured. I will ensure that all your future memories are of warmth and silence, and not of shame. That is my true vow. She turned and reached up, pulling his head down for a gentle, intimate kiss. You did not just give us a future, Lysander. You redeemed our past. The cruelty was not a devastation. It was the final door closing on the life we were never meant to lead. Kyle, now 6, was the living embodiment of their resolution. He was a bright, curious, and utterly secure child. One rainy afternoon, Ilara was teaching him how to read an old, beautifully illustrated map of the barony when he looked up at her, his expression serious. "Mama," he asked, his authentic and simple dialogue cutting through the quiet, "why do people say King Lysander is scary?" Ilara paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because, my love, people fear what they do not understand, and they fear power that is not their own. King Lysander is very old and very powerful, but he uses his strength to protect those he loves. He is fierce, not scary." "Is he a hero?" Kale persisted. Ilara smiled. "He is my hero, Kyle, and yours." She knew Lysander would be standing just outside the door, his superior hearing picking up every word. The third-person limited, omniscient point of view, focused on Ilara's internal state, knew Lysander was listening, a fact that only deepened her conviction in her words. She wanted him to hear it. She wanted him to know, without a doubt, that he was seen not as a monster, but as a savior. The story had reached its uplifting conclusion. The initial heartbreaking emotional tone had softened into deep, steady sentiment. The final scene was set in the conservatory on a rare, sunlit day. Lysander was seated in a velvet upholstered chair, reading one of Kale's old picture books, a sight that still made Ilara's heart clench with tenderness. Kale, playing nearby, suddenly remembered something. He ran over to Ilara, who was tending to a winter rose bush. "Mama, I forgot," he exclaimed, digging into his pocket. He pulled out the small carved wooden bear, now slightly chipped and faded from being carried everywhere. He walked over to Lysander and held it up. "King Lysander," Kyle said clearly, addressing the vampire king formally. "My mama said this is a gift for a father. You are my father now. Can you keep it?" Lysander looked at the bear, then at the earnest, expectant face of the child. His silver eyes, usually so cool and reserved, were warm with an emotion that was profound and utterly human. He took the bear, turning it over in his long fingers, examining the rough carving. He looked up at Ilara, a question in his gaze, a rhetorical pause that spoke volumes. She nodded, her eyes welling up with happy tears. The emotional climax was here, the ultimate acceptance. Lysander tucked the bear into the inner pocket of his coat, close to his heart. "Thank you, Kale Selwyn Veronin," he said, adding the new name with an intimate, solemn inflection. "It is the finest piece of craftsmanship I have ever owned." The deeply sentimental moment hung in the air, the rhythmic, slow burn pacing allowing the viewer to absorb the emotional weight. The final audience addressing style comes into play now, summarizing the lesson. The narrator's worn, earnest voice, with its motivational language, rings out. But sometimes, dear viewer, the worst rejection of your life is merely the universe clearing the path for your true destiny. Ilara, the desperate widow, who tried to trade her future for bread, found that the man who broke her heart was simply a signpost to the man who would heal her soul. He did not just feed her or her son. He gave them a fierce, dark protection and a love that was ancient, true, and utterly faded. And the little wooden bear, a symbol of a desperate, failed bargain, became the ultimate symbol of a perfect, unexpected family. Never fear the storm. Fear the life you refuse to fight for. Because sometimes a cruel count's rejection is the only way to meet a vampire king's heart.